So my talk is, so that looks suspicious, leveraging process memory and kernel and user mode probes to detect shared object injection at scale on Linux. So who am I? I'm Daniel Jary. I'm a security researcher. Previously, I was a senior security researcher at F-Secure, then with Secure, and I basically looked into new attacker techniques, reversed understood how they worked, and tried to generate new detection telemetry to build into the EDR sensor. Prior to that, I worked for UK government for a number of years doing a similar thing and also developing an endpoint agent. And I also did a little bit of a stint as an IR consultant at Mandiant. And I've also previously spoken, but mainly kind of on Windows. So this is the agenda. First, we're just going to kick off what really is shared object injection. Following that, how does it sit in this threat landscape? And then some ELF binary basics to get everyone up to speed. Then we're going to kick off with the first two techniques, and that involves abusing the dynamic linker and how we might build good detection telemetry to detect this. And then we're going to look at real-time injection methods, doing a similar thing, and also look at how an attacker may hide a shared object, and then finally some key takeaways and a cheat sheet. So first off, the threat landscape. So an awful lot of the industry seems to be focused on Windows, and that makes a lot of sense due to its desktop market share. But historically, I think Linux hasn't really got the attention it deserves, at least in my experience of working across different companies with their endpoint sensor. But in 2022, IBM X-Force released a threat intel report basically saying the amount of sophistication of malware on Linux is starting to achieve the same sort of level to that on Windows. And then again this year, we had a similar report from IBM X-Force, and they basically said that there's a greater need for detection tooling to kind of catch up on that. There's a little graphic there from Checkpoint Research. I know there's a few researchers here, which I thought was pretty cool because it kind of details how ransomware in particular has started to proliferate a lot more on Linux over the last couple of years compared to that on Windows. Another thing that was quite interesting was that vFeed published this blog post in 2021, and they highlighted the top 10 most commonly used MITRE attack techniques, one of which was shared object injection. Now you might be thinking, well, this has got kind of a lot of highlighting behind it, then attackers might move away from it because detection telemetry might have caught up. But that doesn't really seem to be the case. Previously, when I worked with Secure, we saw a lot of this attack technique still being used. And also, even to this day, the Dutch MOD released a report about a Chinese rat that essentially used this technique. So attackers aren't really afraid of it. So in general, we have a lack of detection maturity on Linux compared to Windows. And we're also finding that threat groups are having success taking open source code from user mode rootkits and using them directly into some of their samples. So one example of this is the Winty group basically took a lot of the code base from the Azazel open source user mode rootkit and put it into their hidden WASP malware to great effect. And then a similar thing with the Rocky group. They used a shared object injection hiding tool, and they put it straight into their cryptocurrency miner. And then we also have some kind of post-exploitation frameworks like NinjaSec's Puppy, and they're adapting Linux techniques for Windows. So they adapted the reflective DLL injection technique and created the reflective shared object injection technique. And everyone's probably aware there's a lot of kind of conferences and material out there from attacking Linux, but less so from like, the defensive side of things. So what's a shared object? Well, a shared object is fundamentally the equivalent of a dynamic link library. So instead of writing your own function, you can call an export from a library and have that code execute for you instead of having to kind of like implement it yourself. Now, what an attacker might do is they'd inject their shared object into the process memory address space. Then they'd overwrite what's known as the global offset table. Now, this is like the functional equivalent to the import address table on Windows. And then that same function will be called by the ELF binary, and it will call the malicious version instead of the legitimate one. Alternatively, you could have some malicious constructor code that's executed once your malicious library is loaded into the address space. So I wanted to give a brief overview of how ELF binaries sit on disk and in memory. I'm sure pretty much everyone here knows that, but for those that don't, it kind of brings everyone up to speed. So binaries are made up of sections, just like PE files. So we have the text section with our read executable instructions of a program. And enumerating these sections is kind of vital to build decent detection tooling. But unlike the PE file on Windows, when you load the ELF binary into memory, those sections are combined into segments, usually based on their intended page permissions. And so we lose a bit of that granularity. And what you might be thinking, well, we've got the section header table, we can rely on that. But no, it's an optional component, so we need to find like another way of being able to kind of rebuild those sections in memory and identify where they start and finish. So how do we rediscover that? Well, one way is to look at the dynamic segment. Now, this is a little bit different from the other segments in that it retains a one-to-one mapping with a dynamic section. And here's the dynamic section in the readelf output. Essentially, it's just a load of structs that contain information that the dynamic linker needs to load binaries into memory. And some of those structs actually contain pointers to some of the sections that we're interested in. So using that, we can start to reestablish that granularity in our process memory image. So let's kick off with the first two techniques, and these involve abusing the dynamic linker. And I'll be covering two techniques here, DT-needed infections and preloading abuse, which is common amongst usermode rootkits. And these both require intervention prior to a process being executed, so typically an attacker will probably target a group of processes or every process launched on a system. I'm going to talk to you briefly about how you might detect these and build better detection telemetry. So here again is our dynamic section, present in all dynamic link binaries. And what you'll notice is the first few entries in the dynamic section are DT-needed entries. Now, these are essentially the dependencies of a binary. And the dynamic linker will look for these in standard search order paths and load them into memory upon execution. So here we've highlighted a legitimate dynamic section with a DT-needed entry for libc on the top, highlighted in blue. I've also highlighted two other entries, so debug and null entries, and you can safely overwrite these entries without corrupting the binary. So say we don't do anything to those entries and we just execute it normally, then we get our libc and it's pulled into that process memory address space, and on the bottom is the proc file system. But if we overwrite, say, the debug entry with a new DT-needed entry of our malicious lib evil, when we execute it, it's pulled into the address space. So it's really, really simple. So another method is actually just to insert a new DT-needed entry at the top and shift every other entry downwards. So this involves a little bit more work, and you think, why bother? Well, we can ensure that our malicious library is loaded in preference to other libraries, so their exports are resolved first, which means that we don't have to have any sort of stub code that resolves and patches the global offset table. So how might we detect this as a defender? Well, we can look for the absence of those null or debug entries. And also, when you compile a binary, the object linker won't produce DT-needed entries in a non-sequential order, so we can look for this. For the insertion type, well, we can, in order to make space for the string name for our new evil library, shared object even, we need to often make space, and that involves relocating some of the sections or doing something like a reverse text padding infection. So we can kind of check for these indicators and look for non-standard locations where the headers might have been relocated. And here's some example telemetry of a tool that I'm going to talk about in a little while. And basically, I developed this because we were having trouble detecting these types of techniques. On the left, basically, I've highlighted where you can see a DT-needed index of 12, whereas the previous index is 1, so there's a non-sequential order there. So that's like a big indicator. And on the right, we can see that the dynamic string table entry has been extended and the headers have been manipulated. So the next technique is preloading. Now, this is actually a legitimate feature on Linux, and it forces the dynamic linker to load a shared object even if it isn't listed as a dependency. And you can achieve this in like 3 main ways. You can use an environmental variable known as load preload with the name of your malicious shared object. You can use a flag on the dynamic linker. And you can also have a system-wide effect by using the load so preload file. But it's a legitimate feature, and it basically allows developers to ship older shared objects with their program rather than having to rewrite and recompile in order to account for newer versions. But unfortunately, attackers also make use of preloading, and this is because it's essentially a search order hijacking technique. So preloaded objects are given precedence over any other objects, which allows them to hook symbols and execute their constructor code first. And as a result, it's used by numerous user mode rootkits and a number of samples too. So you may be thinking, this is pretty familiar. Detecting this has actually been written about already, but most proposed detections seem to be based around monitoring the existence rather than the effect. And I guess in some cases, if you know just the names and the paths and you have some pre-existing knowledge about that shared object, then you could maybe determine whether it's a malicious event or not. But as the number of hosts begin to scale, it becomes increasingly difficult to perform manual analysis, and that's because we probably don't have the time to pull every binary and reverse engineer it and figure out what it's doing. So I thought, let's build some better telemetry where we can see those hooked functions, the preloaded object responsible for the hook, the location of the hook in memory, and the original shared object the function was hooked from. So on the left is some more example telemetry from a tool I developed. And I run it against the Björk anti-detection, anti-evasion rootkit. And what we can see from here is there's a shared object pretending to be SE Linux. It's preloaded itself into the bash process, and it's hooked a number of functions from libc. Now, all a defender needs to do, or an analyst in SOC, would look at this, compare it to standard SE Linux behavior, and realize, hang on a minute, something odd is up. So how do we build this telemetry? Well, I'm going to skim through the sub-steps for the sake of time, but a full breakdown is actually in the white paper I'm going to be releasing alongside this, and also the slides will be made available. So the first step is to identify all of the imports a process uses and resolve their symbol names. Next, we want to establish a list of base addresses of the shared objects in memory. And instead of using the proc file system, which can actually be easily spoofed through preloading, we want to use a slightly more hooking-resistant way by enumerating an internal structure known as the link map. Next, we want to generate a list of shared objects which may have been successfully preloaded and resolve their exports. And then finally, we can see which exports from the preloaded objects, compare them with the same exports from the non-preloaded objects, and discover any matches. Any matches indicates a hook. Then we can add metadata to it, providing our contextualized hook data that we can output in our telemetry. So if you're wondering the tool I use to generate this telemetry, it's actually specifically my library scanner module in a tool I developed called Elfi Scanner. And that's available on GitHub, open source. And I've also provided a pre-compiled binary using the Holy Buildbox project, so it might give you some portability too. So next, we're going to move on to real-time injection methods. And we're going to talk about libc DLOpen mode, which is kind of like the equivalent of calling load library on Windows, and also reflective shared object injection, which, as you'll imagine, is very similar to reflective DLL injection. And existing detection methods seem to rely on marrying up multiple events, such as ptrace syscalls attaching to other processes, reading the proc file system for like read-write executable permission memory regions, or even indiscriminately scanning memory with Jary. And although you should be doing some of this, when working at scale, it becomes a bit of a blunt tool. And that's because legitimate processes may leave a similar sort of footprint leading to FPs. It doesn't really target shared object injection, but rather injection as a whole. You can also spoof the proc file system. And I guess the biggest one, like blindly scanning memory, is really, really intensive and doesn't scale. So first off, the libc dealopen mode injection. So a simple way to inject a shared object is to debug a victim process and then force it to call a library function that does all the heavy lifting for us. And there's two functions that do this. We've got dealopen and we've got libc dealopen mode. Attackers will almost always use libc dealopen mode because it's exported by libc, and that's importing like 99% of processes, so it's kind of a reliable vector. So we can either write our own injector and force it to call this function, or we could even use a simple GDB one-liner, as seen on the screen. And since this attack technique is predicated on forcing a victim to call libc dealopen mode, an obvious solution is to directly monitor library calls. A common tool that does this is ltrace, though it's not very suitable because it only monitors individual processes or groups of processes. It also uses ptrace under the hood, which is really slow, invasive. It can be blocked with like a trace me flag. So instead, we could use some baked-in dynamic instrumentation that we find on Linux, and by that I mean uprobes and kprobes. So originally designed to generate efficient performance metrics, they were later adapted for security use cases. So I like to think of uprobes and kprobes as the functional equivalent of ETW on Windows. So kprobes allow you to target kernel mode functions and instructions, and uprobes allow you to target user space processes, library functions, providing you know things like the path, offset, and the parameters of that function. So let's go with a uprobe. So first we calculate our offset to libc dealopen mode. If available, we could use the nm tool on Linux in this one-liner, or we can do it manually ourselves, demonstrated in the right screenshot. And since it's on disk, we could use the section header table to find the offset, which makes life a little bit easier. Next, we want to establish the parameters supplied to this function and discover any variations between glibc versions. Once we've done this, we can start to define our uprobe by specifying the path to libc, the offset to the function. We want to extract that first parameter. Now this would be the path to the injected shared object. And then the second parameter will indicate the binding type. For this example, I've used Brendan Grigg of Netflix fame's uprobe wrapper tool. And it's essentially a wrapper around the ftrace instrumentation, but it's great for just pocking quick uprobes. So I ran this on a normal system for 24 hours and performed injection with a tool that makes use of this technique known as Kubo Injector, and it produced 7 events in total, one of which was the injection, and the others were pretty easy to discount based on their binding type and lack of a full path. And I thought that was pretty efficient over 24 hours, only having 7 events. But uprobes also provide the capability to include filters without introducing much of a performance overhead. So once I added a filter based on the binding, we only had that 1 event over the 24-hour period. So that was for detecting the victim. If we wanted to detect the injector, we could take that uprobe event and work back to look at the most recent process that attached to it using ptrace. We could also perhaps use the GDB one-liner as a command line argument if they have used that method. And we could scan for processes that have that libc dealopen mode in the read-only data section. So next up, we have reflective shared object injection. Now, the Linux equivalent of reflective DLL injection, whereby the shared object can be loaded directly from memory rather than disk using a custom loader. Now, InfoSec Gorilla's reflective shared object injection tool and the Puppy framework both use this technique, and it leaves behind a few artifacts that we can check for. So existing kind of blog posts out there from some cybersecurity companies describe how searching for anonymous memory regions with read-write executable protections can reveal signs of SO injection. But as we know, this is easily circumvented by fluctuating the page permissions or even just hooking the output to read dir on the proc file system. So how might we get around this? Well, how about we target the initial anonymous memory allocation with mmap using a kernel probe? So the alert's produced in real time and is unaffected by user mode hooking. But nmap isn't exported directly by the kernel, but the great thing about Linux is that we have the source, so we can go and have a look, and turns out it's just a wrapper around this case, this mmap-p-gof function, and passing through very much the same parameters. And the fact is, this is exported, so we can use it as a target. And then by monitoring the protection and flags parameters, we can reveal the permissions and the memory type provided to mmap. So, for instance, in this case, we want to collect the RDX and RCX registers for our probe. So using the hex value 22, which translates to private and anonymous memory regions, and the value 7 for read-write executable permissions, we can then define our first kprobe. And when I tested this against the InfoSec Gorilla tool, it successfully identified the creation of this memory region in the victim process. Taking this a step further, we could add more probes to the target victim, and like the variations and changes. So for instance, if they wanted to change the protections using something like mprotect, we can define a probe for that too. But more interestingly, we don't want to just look at the memory allocations themselves. We want to do something else, so we can use it as a trigger for our user mode counterpart, our scanner. And we can provide it with the exact address and the exact bit of memory that we want to look at. So that's what I've done here. I've kind of linked it up with Elfie Scanner, and it's gone and searched that individual region of memory, and it's found an embedded shared object in that anonymous memory region. And briefly, we're going to look at how an attacker might hide their shared objects. And this is quite a common thing for attackers to do. So for instance, the Rocky Monero miner did it by hooking functions that read the output of the proc file system, and they used it to hide their malicious shared objects in their cryptocurrency miner. But we can kind of cross-reference numerous data sources, so we can look at those process mappings for the absence of things that we should expect. We can use the link map, which is kind of like a better point of truth. We can also look at those DT-needed entries as well, and we can start to spot discrepancies. And then we can start to write a few rules based on like the paths, the names, the loaded base addresses, if there's a disk backing, and so on. And this is what I did as one of the capabilities inside of Elfie Scanner. And it's kind of outputted telemetry here from a process running the libprocess hiding project on GitHub. And it's done that through identifying that the process mappings exist in the link map, but they don't appear anywhere else, indicating that someone's tried to hide it. So I realize I've kind of blitzed through this, and I've gone a little bit faster than expected. So if your attention is strayed, don't worry. There's a cheat sheet for the past 20-odd minutes of your time, and it will be made available in the slides. And finally, some key takeaways. So first, the Linux threat landscape doesn't really get the attention it deserves, and this leads to detection immaturity and relatively simple memory techniques, such as shared object injection, being effective for attackers. If we don't actually have any telemetry, then we can't write any detections. So hopefully now we have a little bit of a better idea and more answers and tooling on how to find this specific type of injection. And then finally, if by using kprobes and uprobes, we can use them as signals to target individual memory regions, which makes scanning much more applicable in enterprise environments. And that works quite nicely alongside kind of user mode memory scanners, because I think there's a limited instruction set if you're trying to use like an eBPF program. So thanks very much for listening to my talk. QR codes for tool repos on the slide. Are there any questions?